Our final two speakers of this session are Grant Ongers, CTO of Secure Delivery, and Nina Alli, Executive Director of the Biohacking.
Hello and welcome to the Threat Modeling in Healthcare session. I am Nina Alli. I'm the Executive Director of the Biohacking Village at DEF CON, and my bio is here. I've done biomedical cybersecurity, translational medicine, things. I have the honor and privilege of being accompanied by Mr. Grant Ongers, who will now give his bio, and we will then start talking about threat modeling in healthcare.
Thanks, Nina. So there's a ton of information on the slide. What you really want to take away from that is that if you want to get hold of me for OWASP business, because I'm very heavily involved with the OWASP community, grant@ongers.owasp.org. Otherwise, if it's something commercial, grant@securedelivery.io. We do quite a lot of work in this space, both as part of the community as well as commercially. I've been involved in the community for a long time. I really am keen on what it is we're doing here. Everything from DEF CON right the way through to OWASP and all the parts in between. Also, plenty of time doing it. And then jumping in just to kind of set the scene a little bit around threat modeling generally. Threat modeling is essentially about looking at your applications or looking at your environment as an attacker would. The number one way that threat modeling is usually done is using the mnemonic STRIDE, which is spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And I've seen Adam Shostak do that so many times now that every time I hear the mnemonic in my head, I see his face. Basically, it's about looking at systems and trying to understand how they can possibly be broken. And each of these areas, each of these 6 areas of interest are types of vulnerabilities that potentially an attacker could exploit, and the results they're trying to get involved with. So where spoofing is pretending to be something they're not, tampering is about messing with the data in some way, repudiation is about hiding, concealing who they are while they're doing things. Information disclosure is taking the data out, which is what they're primarily trying to do. Denial of service, mainly a skiddy thing where they knock your services off the network. And elevation of privilege, which is the crown jewel, right? That's now I've gotten in and I can do other more interesting things on systems that aren't exposed, or at least weren't supposed to be exposed. Outcomes from a traditional threat modeling exercise is a threat model. And this is a nice template that you can grab from the OWASP threat modeling cookbook. And there's a link down at the bottom there that will help you grab it. But the threat modeling, generically, that's what we're talking about. Understanding a system or a solution from the point of view of an attacker.
So thank you for the introduction to threat modeling. I want to go over a couple of questions just so that people understand the intricacies of how healthcare works and how threat modeling can layer over healthcare to make it more pronounced and to give us more insight. So why does healthcare need a threat model? And just from my own personal insight into it, healthcare is a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week, 365, 66 on leap years day organism that is constantly and consistently moving. And it's exceptional because it's not just people that are inside it moving, it's different devices that are moving along with it. And if you don't have that list of assets that are moving around, or at least in your place, your industry, you can get a little lost. And this healthcare industry is different from other industries in that if one thing changes, a human is directly affected by it. So with all of that backend and insight, for you, what is your takeaway for why healthcare needs a threat model?
So I guess a lot of threat modeling is understanding how pieces work together, because it's usually where we glue stuff together that the glue isn't quite as cemented as it should be. So in the environment you've just described, which is lots of different systems, lots of different components, all interacting with each other in various ways, there's a lot of that cement going on, a lot of that connectivity happening. Any environment that looks like that is going to be complicated to threat model because it's a complex system. It's made more complex by the fact that you have stuff that belongs to us, the hospital, the provider, whatever it might be, and stuff that we allow into our environment in some way, possibly giving it some level of privilege, giving it some level of access, allowing it access to a public Wi-Fi spot or something like that. Or even I need to interact with something on a patient and I need to connect my devices to the patient in some way, right? So all of these things make the model more complex. And it's important to understand what the model looks like in order to be able to create the right defenses. I think threat modeling for healthcare is probably one of the most complex systems there is, primarily because we don't know what all the moving parts are. And we have very little control over, what, 20, 30% of the pieces that move in and out?
Mm-hmm. So I love that you brought that up. So just from the threat modeling standpoint, the mindset, how would a healthcare organization start to threat model? So as a proviso to this question, the FDA in the United States has started to ask medical device manufacturers to threat model their device so that those threat models and the device can be brought in to the hospital ambulatory care center, and they give it all as a package and say, here. So
what the FDA has asked medical device manufacturers to do is unfortunately more than what you've just described. What you've described is exactly what they should be doing, i.e. this is a black box, this is a thing. We, the device manufacturers, have taken the thing apart and we understand all the pieces that fit together inside it. We understand the threat model for this device. But this black box has a bunch of inputs and has a bunch of outputs. These are the interfaces that it has with your systems. These are how you can expect it to interact with those systems. And these are the threats we think you can expect. But that should be all they give you, right? Black box, inputs and outputs, threats potentially impacting those inputs and outputs. I think it's a good thing if that's what they were doing. And I think it would be a great way to help hospitals or care centers integrate new devices into their systems. But it also only covers a very small amount of those devices. So what do you about the rest? What do you do about the random pieces that have walked in off the street attached to humans?
And the legacy devices. Because we have all of these brand new, magical, glittery, wonderful things that are walking in and they have a lot of supervision already built into them. But then there's also these other legacy devices that were built to last 10, 15, 20 years that have no coverage around them. And we have to layer all of these different things around it.
And they're not going away anytime soon, right? Because it's an X-ray machine and it still does X-rays, right? There's no reason to replace it. It was an expensive machine when they bought it. And the manufacturer is not going to be doing massive updates to systems like that. And if they are, does that fall under the same guidelines? Does a threat model have to come with an update now? So yes, the whole IoT space is going to have the same problem. Medical devices more so than the rest, because legacy will be around forever.
So how does the threat modeling account for vulnerabilities versus exploits?
So exploits are, I know how to break the thing. Vulnerabilities are simply, this is a thing that can be potentially broken. With that concept, I mean, it's strictly speaking, not entirely the whole story, but just broadly speaking, if we think of it in those terms, if you know about exploits on a particular device, you have to defend against them, right? Because there is a way in the wild to break this thing, to make it do something it shouldn't. Vulnerabilities are what we're really looking for with threat modeling, because we want to prevent our systems being held hostage by something that suddenly appears, by an exploit that we haven't heard of before, purely because we know that it could be vulnerable to something. So yeah, I guess we have to cater for the vulnerabilities, because exploits we should definitely already cover.
I want to talk about a Black Swan event that recently happened, and I want your input on this. And I'm going to read from my notes just so I don't get it completely and utterly wrong. So there was recently an event at UHS, which is an American hospital system, and unfortunately they had a trick bot enter their systems, which are botnets that are networks of computers secretly infected by remote controlled malware. And Microsoft ended up taking back control and command of their servers so that they could take down this botnet and disable the IPs that were used by this botnet. So again, because it is current state a Black Swan event, how can we take this model that just happened? How can we integrate that into our threat models, if possible?
Well, so firstly, we need to threat model for the vulnerabilities that we know exist in our existing hardware, our existing solutions. So we need to first understand what those vulnerabilities look like and get a good grasp on how they potentially could be exploited. TrickBot invading hospitals is, as you said, Black Swan. It's unusual. It isn't what it was designed to do. But it obviously exploited a known vulnerability in a system to get in. That vulnerability probably was known to the manufacturer, or should have been known to the manufacturer, and potentially that should have been disclosed in some way. If you have a solution that uses X, Y, and Z, and you know that you're using X, Y, and Z, and there are vulnerabilities in X, Y, and Z that can be exploited, it's a good idea to make sure that you understand what those vulnerabilities are and that you model around that. I don't want to hammer too harshly on them, because let's get the basics right, broadly, cover most of the things before we worry about these very specific, very unusual, very hard to predict events.
So I realize that I spoke from a point of view where I know things, and I want to take a step back. A lot of hospitals may have IT folks,
Yep.
they may not have IS folks. So thinking in terms of that, as well as information security folks, what kind of education does someone need to start threat modeling?
So although threat modeling is something that a lot of IS folks do, that isn't how I advocate for it. The world that security delivery comes from is primarily in the actual application development phases. And we advocate for threat modeling to be done by developers. If you're threat modeling a solution, an operational system in production, as in more than just a single application, you're modeling a bunch of interconnected devices like a hospital, it should be done by individuals who understand how those pieces are fitting together. So it is an IT thing, right? This is an IT person who knows the solutions that he's managing, how they exactly are supposed to interact with each other. Now, it's about the management, because there are some systems that are completely unmanaged by hospital IT, that they're managed by a medical device manufacturer or something like that. And then the responsibility falls on those individuals to ensure that the threat model is clear. But it is about the management. It should never be a security thing, right? It's about protecting the things that I'm managing and the things that I'm maintaining. And that's an operations side thing. And if you're building, it's a development side.
Right, so it's starting to set that baseline.
Yeah.
So understandably, we are doing threat models for things that we are known and that we can account for. How do you manage shadow IT in a threat model? Because healthcare has a lot of different things going on.
Yep.
They could move through that. So ideas.
Shadow IT is incredibly difficult to combat, and you'd probably be better off combating the causes of shadow IT than trying to deal with the result of having shadow IT in your environment. It's really difficult to deal with a server that you never knew existed unless you're doing like random scans and you're killing devices that you don't recognize. And then, of course, you risk killing things that are critical to the running of the hospital, because that shadow IT might be exactly how the hospital is running. Mm-hmm. Without that piece that we don't know about as IT, the hospital doesn't function. So why is it shadow IT? Deal with that side of it. honestly, if you have a shadow IT environment, you're dealing with that problem. You need to look at the environment that created it and deal with that. People are not wanting to run their own servers under their desks because they think it's fun. Generally, it's because they need it for some reason, and you haven't accounted for that.
A lot of industries are starting to move over into zero trust. And I think healthcare is going to maybe be one of those first adopters because of the way that it's built. So do you have any thoughts on zero trust plus threat modeling plus healthcare equals?
Well, so zero trust is an approach to connecting devices to each other, connecting systems together, a way of exchanging information between systems that requires both solutions, both ends of the communication string to identify themselves and then ensure that a trust link is established. And that is transient. It happens for the exchange that we need to do right now. It's a solution that was worked out quite well by Google. And there are tons of papers, really good papers by the Google crew on how zero trust should be implemented, how they've done it.
So just to add on to that, it works.
It assumes a completely violent, aggressive, non-safe network environment.
Exactly. So before it was trust but verify, and now it's never trust, always verify.
Correct. Yeah. And the primary thing about zero trust is we spend a lot of our time talking about how I have this thing and it's inside my network, it's behind my firewalls. So when this thing wants to talk to other things, I just let it because it's on the same side of the firewall. Everything must be hunky-dory. We kind of build these whole castle structures where we put some nice big walls and moats around it. We layer up our defenses because defense in depth is good, but we still just assume that if you're inside the castle, inside the moat, you're allowed to do whatever you like. And that isn't the reality, right? The true way of doing things, or the zero trust way of doing things, is that depending on the service that you're interacting with, there's a different requirement for proving identity and for proving that you have the not just that you're the right person to come in, but you're allowed to do the things that you're going to be doing.
So you're the elevation of privilege as well.
Yeah.
Right.
So given zero trust as a way of approaching building services, well, yes, it solves most of the problems, if not all of them. And it makes the shadow IT thing go away completely, because the shadow IT components can't talk to the rest of the infrastructure, can't talk to the rest of the services, unless they have a way of authenticating against those services. And if they have a way of authenticating into those services, it means it's probably using private key encryption, as it should be doing, which means that it isn't actually shadow IT anymore because we gave them keys. And if we gave them keys, then we should know what they're doing. It does mean that threat modeling becomes incredibly simpler. It is much easier to create threat models in a zero trust environment because you don't have to worry about other things that aren't in the diagram. Because if they're not in the diagram, they literally can't talk to things that are in the diagram and therefore can be ignored. Because that is a big part of the leap of faith that we take in doing threat models, is that we have a picture that is as close to a real thing as possibly. With zero trust, it must be the real thing, right? The model gets better.
Great. This is what we hope for. So I want to make sure that people understand that there are resources for all of these things. And I know you work extensively with OWASP and putting out tons of information on this. So if there are any sites or things that they can reach you on, quick 2 minutes, 2 sentences on that. So
the best place to reach me, if you want to talk about this sort of thing, is probably on Twitter, REWTD on Twitter. If you're wanting to look for resources that the foundation has on threat modeling, there's a lot. The OWASP.org website will lead you off to everything. There are tons of projects around threat modeling and lots of individuals who are very active in that area. So please get involved in those and take a look at what they've got. The cheat sheets are probably the best places to start. In fact, the cheat sheets are the best place to start with anything that OWASP potentially has. And it's also really nicely laid out. So that's where I'd suggest going. There are other resources for threat modeling. One that you've actually mentioned to me in the past, Nina, so perhaps give them a shout out here as well. Includes no dirt.
Well, thank you. So just at the Biohacking Village, we have a hospital set up that mimics a real life hospital, and we do all kinds of vulnerability tests on it, as well as individual devices where the hacker can have a face-to-face moment with the medical device manufacturer and give them the vulnerability and say, this is what's wrong, and go through it. And we've actually done a lot of really good work there and helping patient care and patient safety through that. There's another enterprise called Omada Health, and what they did was create a learning mechanism, a learning tool called Includes No Dirt. And what they've done is include the medical side with the threat modeling so that you can make it easier as a learning tool. And additionally, at the Biohacking Village, we have a device lab where we have the medical device manufacturers come in with their devices, and they have face-to-face conversations with the hacker community, and they can discuss the pen tests and any other vulnerabilities face-to-face in real time and come up with ways to mitigate those issues. So on that note, thank you so much for listening to our talk. Grant, thank you for being here with me, and thank you Cyber Week for inviting us.
Thanks, Nina. It's always great to get a chance to chat to you, and thank you, Cyber Week.